Welcome to Perspectives El Paso. I'm Leon Blevins of El Paso Community College Television. This is mid-September of 2016. Back in the early 1990s, a friend of mine came up to me and said he had been approached by people with a new organization here called the Opportunity Center about helping to plug in El Paso Community College into a support for them. And he was over some of the technical services and computers, and desktop computing was fairly new. And he told me that he would like if I had any upgrades of my computers, if I'd pass along my older computers. And I said, well, I'm at the income level yet. I haven't been able to upgrade very much, but if I do, I'll pass some along. What he was doing is helping to teach people off the streets, the homeless, how to learn computers so that they would have a chance to get some jobs out in the community. His name was Lynn Slater. He ended up marrying a friend of mine here in El Paso that I'd known since the 1960s, beginning in 1965, a woman named Billy. And he and Billy became very active with helping the homeless in El Paso. Later, they went to Austin to be close to their children and grandchildren and lived there for a number of years and did the same kind of work there. A heart for the homeless and those in need. I have with me today a guest that I've had on before who has a heart for the homeless and those in need. His name is John Martin. When I first interviewed him, he was with Salvation Army. And then later I did another interview with him where he's talking about human trafficking and an organization about hope for those being trafficked. And then just recently I was approached about doing an interview about the Opportunity Center and what it is today, and of all things, John Martin's name pops up. He now is with them. John, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Do you keep getting fired or what?
No, I don't keep getting fired. I just look at the opportunities, and as I left the Salvation Army to create the Center of Hope, which is the organization that focuses on trafficking, and they're alive and working well at this point, and I'm very proud of that as we work through it.
And that meant sex trafficking, labor trafficking, all kinds of trafficking issues.
It truly does. I mean, it tends to fall in those two general categories, sex or labor, but there are different offshoots of it as you look at child labor and what happens with the children versus the adults.
Okay. So now you moved over to the Opportunity Center. Tell us about that.
Well, actually, I've been working with the Opportunity Center for approximately 2.5 years now. And then it became a full-time position this last December of 2015. And it's been very exciting because it sort of takes me back to my roots. As you mentioned, when we first met and we first talked here, I was with the Salvation Army. And the Salvation Army operates a shelter for homeless families here in El Paso. And I think one of the key distinctions between the two, even though they both serve the homeless, the Opportunity Center in and of itself really works with the single adult population. Both men and women of all ages. And so that's really what got me to get started in the nonprofit world, because the reality is, and a lot of people don't know this about myself, by education I'm an engineer. And I spent 20 years doing environmental consulting work before I decided to do a career change about 15 years ago.
Work with humans.
And work with humans instead of numbers.
Right.
But you still can't quite avoid the numbers. In fact, we have a new coworker of mine that came on board a couple of days ago, and she made the observation that when I take notes in my notebook, it's still on graph paper. So you still can't get rid of that old side.
Yeah. And the way that you look at things, the way you look at life. And engineers tend to look at things generally different than the general population in some ways.
Very much so.
Organized, structured.
Organized, structured, sort of logical, if you want to use that term as well, as you sort of pick it up. And that's interesting that you bring that up, because when I first started with the Salvation Army many years ago, I considered myself to be a very strong writer. But I realized very quickly that technical writing, which is what I was used to, was very different from writing grants. And so I had my fair share of declinations, if you want to refer to them as
a learning
such.
curve.
I would say there was a learning curve involved.
Okay, so you were helping them to write grants and things like that at the Opportunity Center? Is that what you were doing?
That's what I
as a
was
volunteer?
doing initially until I took the position on full time, and I guess we sort of generally describe this as fund development. But really what's happening with the Opportunity Center, and why I was so excited about joining you today, is to talk a little bit about what we're doing to recreate the vision of what the Opportunity Center is and what it is going to be within the next few years. We still focus on the homeless population, and many people don't realize that it's not just a single structure that houses men or women. The Opportunity Center, from its founding, you talked about Mr. Slater and his assistance on the front end. It was established in 1994, and essentially at that time it was a single warehouse. There was no food service. It was just simply a place for individuals to come off the streets and to get out of the weather. And what started it was a gentleman and his wife by the name of Ray and Lily Tolias. They themselves have had their own lived experience with homelessness. And in the prior year, which would have been 1993, there were 3 deaths on the streets as a result of exposure. And so from 1994, Ray Tolias, along with several different partners within the community, which still includes the El Paso Community College to this day, they started envisioning what this safety net should look like. What was the best way to serve the individuals? And so from that one warehouse, which is still in existence today, however, it no longer looks like a warehouse, it's an office space with a shelter, we now have 10 different programs. And when I say programs, that's 10 different houses. And a majority of those, with the exception of 2, are all within about a 5 to 6 block radius
What
of the main
neighborhood?
shelter.
You're on, I know Myrtle. I've been down there when the warehouse was there. That's basically all it was. Within that area around the Myrtle Street area?
Yes, in fact, the address of the Opportunity Center is 1208 Myrtle.
Okay.
So if you go 6 blocks toward downtown, as an example, you'll see our Veterans Transitional Living Center, which is a 20-bed facility that focuses solely on veterans. But if you go the other direction about 3 blocks, you'll see the women's program. In fact, that's one of our newest programs, what we have entitled La Casa de las Abuelitas, which is the shelter for the elderly and the frail. And then just across the alley, as you go over toward McGoffin Street, you'll see the Safe Haven, which is the housing that we have for the mentally ill. And so it has grown proportionally to the point that the Opportunity Center for the Homeless now touches roughly 50% of the adult homeless population in El Paso.
Oh, my word.
And to put that into numbers, on a given evening, and this sounds like a relatively small number, so I'm going to qualify it before I provide it, we house anywhere from 300 to 350 individuals a night. But if you look at it over the course of a year, we serve approximately 5,000 unique individuals per year. And that's representative of the transient nature of the population that we're working with as well.
Well, you have some other organizations that are also dealing with some. Salvation Army had residences where some people could come for a while. The homeless shelter that was over on the west side, it's now being moved. And they're also being moved in that Myrtle Street area, if I remember.
Actually, you're referring to the Rescue Mission,
The
and we're
Rescue
looking
Mission.
forward to having them as neighbors here in the near future. They'll be about 1,000 feet away from us. But if you understand where we're at on Myrtle, the Rescue Mission will relocate on the, I got to get my directions correctly here, but it would be on the east side of Cotton.
Right.
So you would take McGoffin Street and then cross Cotton, and then you'll see the new Rescue Mission
There
on
have
the
been
right-hand
some recent
side.
articles about that, including photographs about that shelter moving over there. I know in looking at the past, and I've worked in civic activities such as you have, and I used to be a pastor, and my wife and I'd worked with girls in the girls' home and things like that. And sometimes people have the attitude, not in my neighborhood. Have you and your other officials worked with this issue? It's all right to help the homeless, but just don't help them in my neighborhood.
I've heard a couple different terms. Like I said, you mentioned not in my neighborhood. You can also say not in my backyard. The terminology out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
Okay, if you want to look at it as such. And yes, we face that all the time. It's a stigma that has been attached to those that are homeless. And it's predominantly as a result because they don't understand as to what's really happening with these individuals. About 30 to 40% of the population we serve, for example, do have some form of mental illness. And in select cases, whether we're working with those that are documented or those that are legally here versus those that aren't, some have access to services, but some don't. And so accessibility as it relates to medical care and behavioral health is still a key issue this year. In fact, that's sort of a nice segue into one of our newest initiatives, which has gone very well, in that we are really focusing right now on what we call ending chronic homelessness. And chronic homelessness is a definition that our friends at HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, provide for us. And when you look at that without getting into all the detail, that means that they've been diagnosed with a mental illness and that they've been homeless for a certain period of time. And so therefore they are the chronic homeless. And HUD has asked each of our communities, to include El Paso, to look at ending chronic homelessness, not managing it, but ending chronic homelessness by the end of 2017. And so we've been very successful in looking at our programs, evaluating them, making some changes where it was needed so that we can focus on that population. I mentioned the safe haven earlier. I mentioned the housing for the mentally ill. We call it the safe haven. We're going to be repurposing that structure, if everything goes as planned, to permanent supportive housing for the chronically homeless. And then we've been working with local landlords, one in particular, and they've agreed to provide us additional units that are going to be scattered throughout the community so that we can provide housing for those individuals as well. And what's really important about that is that you can't just simply house somebody but you've also got to make these services available to them on a voluntary basis. They need to be treated like you or I, where they have a choice as to whether or not they want to be able to access those services, but they do need to be available.
Let's deal with the medical one then.
Right.
Many of these people can function well if they have proper medication. Do you have doctors, people in the medical field that give you some volunteer services, or do you have to pay for certain services to get these people stabilized where they can live comfortably with others in that?
Actually, we're somewhat unique in direct answer to your question. One of our community partners is Central San Vicente.
Okay.
They are a healthcare provider. And as you mentioned, we started back in the early 90s, and as time developed, we developed an on-site clinic within the Opportunity Center. So the medical care is literally one floor above where the men's shelter is.
Oh, okay.
And so for them, it's not a question of making an appointment. It's just a question of simply walking upstairs.
Okay.
And so then our support staff, our case managers, work with the individuals, because you have to also look at the relationships and their individual concerns. Sometimes there's a distrust, okay, of the institution, if you want to refer to it as such. So we develop those relationships, get them upstairs. Central San Vicente also provides some assistance with regard to behavioral health as well. We do have a nurse practitioner, psychiatric nurse practitioner on site, who works under the supervision of a psychiatrist here locally. She has done an incredible job in helping us in maintaining the medication and other issues. But here's something that may interest you too, that as it relates to the behavioral health, we have brought a new partner into the community, which is the Hogg Foundation for Mental Health, and they're based at UT Austin on their campus. And what they're doing is they're helping us develop over the next 2 to 3 years what's called a WRAP program, and WRAP is Wellness Recovery Action Plan, which looks at not only your traditional level of care, but also alternative methods of care, and actually working with their individual conditions.
Okay. What about their spiritual needs? I know that sometimes they're going through spiritual crises and alcoholism and methamphetamines maybe they're coming out of or something, and sometimes chaplains are willing to volunteer some of their services to help deal with some of these situations.
We have a number of individuals that assist us with that. We've got different churches, regardless of faith or denomination, that come in on a regular basis, that provide Bible study, that provide the worship. They'll also provide transportation to and from worship. But to bring about the concept that I mentioned with regard to the medical care, we now have a Center of Peace that is located on campus that is operated by Sister Helen. She is a sister of Loretto. I want to make sure I don't get into too much trouble. I'm going to make sure I have the correct.
Okay, right.
And so we have that now accessible right there. Also strong partners for us is Manuel Methodist, which is right around the corner, back behind us on McGoffin Street.
Okay.
So they're very active with us. The church that I attend, which is University Presbyterian Church, was also one of those individuals at the very beginning that helped establish the Opportunity Center, and they've carried through that same support for the last 23 to 25 years.
Wow. When I was an undergraduate in college, Wayland Baptist College in Plainview, Texas, my first experience with rescue missions was going with preacher boys, and we'd go over and we'd do short sermons for them and some counseling work with them and so on. Eventually, I was pastoring a church, and I was close to Fort Worth, and would do some counseling work in a jail, and all kinds of people in jail, of course. And you have to be careful you're not trying to proselytize too severely, but letting them know there's spiritual people there that are willing to give them some help and support and prayer for them.
And sometimes the term is overused, but I think it's very appropriate. You have to look at the holistic approach of the healing process,
right.
all the way across the board.
Right.
And that's really what is the center of what we call the Opportunity Center. Because the other thing that will surprise a lot of your viewers, over half of our staff are either homeless or formerly homeless. And it's what we call a recovery through service model.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have individuals on staff that don't necessarily have the education that others do, but we couple them with those that have the education so that the individuals understand what that means to be homeless and how to be able to approach those. And it's been a very successful model. In fact, it's somewhat unique from what I understand because we have a staff of about 70 individuals. So we're looking at about 35 to 40 on a given day that they themselves are either currently homeless or formerly homeless, mm-hmm. that are on staff caring for those that have similar lived experiences.
Well, one of my sisters, I had two sisters, and one of them was an alcoholic. Well, both were alcoholics, but one of them, she and her husband got some real treatment for their alcoholism, and she later began to do counseling work in jails and help people to get out and get in the proper situation, probation officers and so on. And it was quite clear that those who had the problem were most able to help those that had the problem and can live from their past experience and identify with what happened to them.
And we're actually taking that to the next step as well. And again, that's through the partnership with the Hogg Foundation that I just mentioned. But the other half of what we've been tasked to do with that partnership is to develop a peer support program.
Right.
And again, that's through that WRAP program. And I think people need to understand that when you look at the Opportunity Center for the Homeless, and most people, if you walk down the street, you'll say, do you know what the Opportunity Center does? And you're going to hear, no, not really. Don't even know who they are. Right. Okay, because they've done such a great job over the last 23 years of working with the homeless. We are the only facility in El Paso that has no barriers to access services. So to use terms that I'm not very comfortable with, but the public will recognize, mm-hmm. we have the alcoholics, mm-hmm. we have the drug addicts, we have the elderly, the frail, the mentally ill, because none of that is used to screen them out of services. It's truly an open door policy. And so once we bring them in, then we have the ability to connect them with those services. I mentioned Centro San Vicente, I mentioned the Center of Peace. One of the three that I haven't mentioned that's one of our strong partners is Aliviani.
Oh, yes.
Okay, on the substance abuse side of the fence. They're also housed within our facilities. And so it's, I hate to use the term one-stop shop, but that's how it was designed. And where we're seeing the changes now within our community and nationally is that HUD is focusing on what they call housing first. And so they're basically trying to say that we need to minimize the need for the safety net, the emergency shelters, and we need to have rapid placement into housing for those that are homeless.
Yes, I've noticed news reports on that.
Right. And so our community, El Paso, is struggling with it to a great degree because the community in general has been so reliant on HUD funds to fund that safety net system. And here's HUD that now has a funding shift that says, no, we recognize the need for the shelters, but we don't want to pay for it. And I'm being a little bit blunt in that respect. Mm-hmm. You need to look at other resources to be able to fund that. And we want to focus on housing. And so as I mentioned, we've got the additional beds for the chronically homeless. We're hoping to expand on that program. But what we're concerned with from a community perspective is that we've had a huge investment, and I'm a lifelong El Pasoan. I was born and raised here, and I know we're few and far between, okay? And I love what I see in El Paso right now, to be able to go to a baseball game or to go to the Plaza Theater to watch a movie, and now that we've got a Starbucks next door, I can have a cup of coffee before I walk in to watch the movie. It's really exciting. Yeah. So we've had this huge level of investment as it relates to quality of life. But we are, as a community, overlooking the need for the investment in quality of place. Because what we're seeing, and we've seen it now for the last 3 years, we have programs which have included the Opportunity Center that have lost federal funding. And so the reality is some of those programs are going to close their doors. And those individuals may not have any recourse but then to go back out to the streets. Now, we're doing everything possible to prevent that from happening. But we're having a very hard time convincing our leadership, both at the city and the county level, to say that you really need to look at this before it becomes a crisis. So we're trying to take somewhat of a proactive approach to it versus reactive.
Well, years ago, I think it was a Florida case, the U.S. Supreme Court said you could not put someone in prison just because they were mentally ill. And so they dumped a lot of the mentally ill out into the communities and had all kinds of problems, not considering the after effects of their decision. Programs that were ready for those people that they were releasing. And so we heard after the war in Vietnam, for example, quite often we'd hear this, that about 1/3 of those on the street were homeless just because they were uneducated and poor and didn't know how to make a living. And others were mentally ill, and others were alcoholics or addicted to some other substance. That was usually just alcoholics. I thought that was rather a broad generalization, a third, and a third. Now tell us a little bit about, you mentioned a while ago your general vicinity. Do you want to give us a telephone number or a website for people to contact if they would like to volunteer? They have a heart of caring.
Right. All you need to do as far as getting access to our website, which is currently under development, but it is still accessible, is just get in there and Google the Opportunity Center for the Homeless. And it'll take you right to it. We do have a Facebook page, not only for the Opportunity Center, but for some of our programs as well as they work through it. The general number for the office is area code 915-577-0069. My extension, if you want to talk to me directly, and I have no hesitation in giving it out, is extension 272. Or you can contact me on my cell phone. I'd be more than happy to have that conversation with you. And that's area code 915-231-8882. I will caution you that if I'm in the office, sometimes I don't get the best of reception on my cell phone because, as you mentioned, it was an old warehouse, and you may recall what it used to be. From what I understand, it was a meat packing plant, and some of the walls in that building are about 1 foot to 1.5 foot thick, so you don't get the best of reception, especially when you're sitting in my office.
Well, you're in the human resource area of working. You need to be in contact. The people need to be in contact with you.
Right.
And you never know when someone that's in crisis, what a difference you can make. You want to talk about some success stories without maybe mentioning the names of some of the people?
I can. In fact, there was one that was just recently publicized, and it was a story that I was unaware of until I watched the local news myself that evening. Okay. I mean, I had heard other stories. But this was a young man. He was a single father. He had children, lost his job. And as a result, he simply couldn't afford to pay his rent anymore. And so he ended up in one of our programs, which is the Willie Sanchez Rosales Family Center. That's the one program out of the 10 that does focus on the family. The rest of it's all single adults. And as he indicated, he was able, through their assistance, to find work, to find some support, and he was able to get back out into a place of his own. But you also have to look at the other side of the fence. And this is a story that I don't like to tell, but it's so true. And it's the reason that we just recently opened up La Casa de las Abuelitas, is that we had a 90-year-old woman that was dropped off in our facility by her daughter. And the daughter simply said, "I can't handle it anymore." And so we have a number of individuals, both male and female, that we recognize will be spending their last days with us. Because they simply don't have the support. We do need volunteers as we work with the men and the women of all ages. And of course, the different type of work is going to be a little bit different, and I would encourage you to call me at the numbers that I just gave previously. But for example, we have groups that come in that provide activities for the women within La Casa de las Abuelitas. In fact, we heard some exciting news yesterday. We're going to be able to do a little bit of an arbor out in the courtyard for them so that we can provide a nice area for them. And so we're really concerned about their safety, number one, because we have a number of elderly that don't know that they have any other option than the streets at this point. And those are the ones we need to pull in off the streets. But those stories go from day to day. We have success stories just in those 35 to 40 people on our staff that are now working and are bringing in a paycheck, albeit it's not a lot of money, but it's much more than what they have, and we continue to work with them even though they're working with us so that we can make sure that there is some sustainability within their lives so that they can go out on their own and they recognize that they can manage their individual conditions. Because I've heard that same thing you mentioned earlier about the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 across the board. Sometimes an alcoholic is drinking because he has no access to health care services, so it's a form of self-medication just to dull the pain. You have individuals that are fleeing domestic violence, which we have a large number of as well. Okay, they're there for their own personal safety. You've got a number of mental health concerns, and so we're looking to partner further with EHN, Emergence Health Network. But then what do we do with those that are undocumented? They're people just like you and I.
There's so many needs. We have about 1 minute left, and I want to say something with regard to you that work at this. You also need support. I know that people that work with the terminally ill, they need support. Those of you that work with these special people, homeless, and they're being dropped off and so on. So there are times that you need to get away and talk to somebody else in an objective setting. Get someone to take you to a baseball game or something like that. So we want to urge our audience to not only be volunteers to perhaps go to the center, but to help those who work in this kind of ministry to make El Paso, Texas, a better place in which to live. John, thanks for being with me again.
Thank you. I enjoy it, and I look forward to hopefully coming back soon in the near future.
Wherever you work, I know you're doing a great job. Thank you very much.
Thank you.